She was building her cabin one log at a time, and most days the sky felt as wide and endless as the loneliness she tried not to name. Claire had counted the logs the way some folks counted prayers or debts. 20 for the walls already up, 6 more stacked along the ground waiting to be hoisted, and another dozen still to be dragged from the creek bed where she'd felled the pines earlier in the season. Every muscle in her body burned in that steady, honest way that work has of filling a person with purpose. And yet when the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long across the prairie, the quiet could startle her. Quiet meant time to think, time to remember, time to ache. She set her shoulder against the newest timber, gritting her teeth and pushing it inch by inch toward the frame. A breeze carried the smell of sage and horses, and she froze, breath caught tight. Horses meant riders, riders meant curiosity, and curiosity had a way of turning into questions Claire did not want to answer. Then she heard the jingle, faint but unmistakable, the small metallic music of spurs. Someone was nearby, moving slowly enough to be watching. She backed away from the log, brushed sawdust from her palms, and lifted her chin. If there was one thing the past year had taught her, it was that nobody survived out here by shrinking. A tall chestnut gelding came into view first, then the man astride him. He wore a battered hat, the brim pulled low enough to shadow his eyes, and he sat the saddle like he'd been born there. The horse stopped at the edge of the clearing, as if of its own accord. The man took in the unfinished cabin, the tools laid out in careful order, the woman with the squared shoulders and wary stare. "Afternoon," he said at last, voice quiet as a creek in drought. "Didn't mean to spook you." "You didn't," Claire said. She straightened another inch, just to prove it. "This is private land. I know. Belongs to the Harper parcel." His gaze flicked to the tree line, then back. "Name's Illy Carter. I run cattle on the other side of the ridge. I pass through now and again, checking fences and such. Saw the smoke a few weeks back, saw the logs, figured I'd say hello before the house got finished and the door closed firm." Claire studied him. He looked like the country itself, weathered, spare, reliable. There was grief tucked into the corners of his mouth, something old and patient. He tipped his hat, and for a strange beat she imagined gentleness as something you could wear and take off. "Claire," she said, "just Claire." "Well, just Claire," he replied with a faint smile. "You're building yourself a fine place." She glanced at the frame, at the clumsy notches she'd taught herself to carve, at the seams packed with moss and clay. "It'll keep the wind out," she said. "That's all I need." He dismounted, slow and unthreatening. "May I?" he asked, nodding toward the partially lifted log. "That one looks like it means to argue." "It always does," she said before she could stop herself. He stepped forward, wrapped both hands around the timber, and with a steady, practiced movement guided it into place. The beam slid home with a satisfying thud. He didn't gloat or wink or offer commentary. He just dusted his gloves off and stepped back as if he were standing in church. "Thank you," Claire said, begrudging, happy to lend a hand. "You working this alone?" "Yes." She heard the defensiveness in the word and didn't soften it. "I'm capable. I can see that." His eyes traced the joinery again, this time with respect. "Takes grit and more patience than most folks were born with." He didn't crowd her, didn't look like a man hungry to pry, and yet something about his presence unsettled her, the way it loosened the knots she kept tied tight around her heart. He stayed a moment longer, as if the silence had room for both of them, then hitched his reins. "If you need anything, rope, tools, another pair of hands, you can find my place west of here, 2 miles down, red barn with a leaning weather vane. I owe the land for what it's given me. Helping neighbors is part of that." She wanted to say she wasn't his neighbor, that she needed no one, that the ground beneath her feet belonged to independence and no other claim. Instead, she said, "I'll keep it in mind." He nodded, mounted, and rode away, the jingle of spurs fading into the broad afternoon. When he was gone, Claire set her palms against the new beam and let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She didn't trust kindness, not anymore. Kindness had a way of turning into possession, and possession into cages. Her past was a list she refused to reread. A father who bartered promises he couldn't keep. A fiancé who wanted her voice soft and her body quiet. And then the accident that had taken everything familiar and left her alone with a small sum of insurance money and a map of land available cheap. So she had bought the acreage, loaded her wagon, and driven toward a horizon that wasn't full of other people's expectations. The cabin would be hers. The life would be hers. If she could build the walls high enough, maybe the loneliness would stay on the other side. Eli rode home with the picture of her burned behind his eyes, the determined set of her jaw, the way she braced against pain and still moved forward. He knew something about pain. He had lost Helen 3 winters ago to a fever that came early and refused to leave. One week they were mending fences together, laughing at the stubbornness of calves, planning next year's garden. The next week he was sitting by the bed, counting breaths that grew fewer and farther between until the last exhale stole the world's color. People told him time softened grief. Maybe it did. What he felt now wasn't the sharp stabbing ache anymore. It was a hollow echo, like voices in an empty barn. He worked long days. He mended everything he could. He kept the place running because that was what love became when the person was gone, maintenance, quiet and faithful. But there were nights when the ranch creaked around him, and he'd have traded all the cattle on God's earth for the sound of another chair scraping across the floor. Seeing Claire there, stubborn and alone, stirred something, not desire exactly, not yet, more like recognition. 2 people holding fast because nothing else had held them. He cooked himself beans and cornbread, fed the horses, and leaned against the fence until the stars came out. Then, with a sigh, he went inside. He lit the lamp. He reached instinctively for the second plate he no longer used, stopped, and smiled ruefully at himself. "Old habits," he murmured. He slept poorly, dreaming of logs and unfinished walls, of a woman lifting more than her share because no one else would. The next morning, Claire woke to a pale sky and a dull ache across her shoulders. She boiled coffee, swallowed a biscuit gone stale, and went back to work. There were still 12 logs by the creek, each one a challenge she meant to overcome. She dragged the first with a makeshift sledge she'd built from scrap boards, legs shaking with the effort. When she reached the rise near the cabin, her boot slipped. The world tilted. The log lurched forward and pinned her lower leg just shy of the knee. The pain was bright, shocking, alive. She bit down on a cry and shoved, but the timber was heavier than her stubbornness. She tried again, fingers scrabbling in dirt, the smell of crushed grass sharp in her nose. Her breath came ragged, and memory roared, of other kinds of being trapped, of rooms where the windows didn't open. "Don't," she whispered to the rising panic. "Not now." The wind carried a sound then, hoof beats fast and purposeful. She closed her eyes. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of humor. "Claire." Ellie's voice came closer than she expected. She swallowed her pride with the dust. "Over here." He appeared at the crest, swung off his horse in one smooth motion, and took in the situation. No hesitation, no fuss. He braced a shoulder against the log, planted his boots, and heaved. The timber rolled back enough for her to yank her leg free. She scooted backward, gasping, and clutched at her calf. "You hurt bad?" he asked, crouching. "I'm fine." The word was habit and lie all at once. Pain throbbed deep, angry. just bruised. He studied the swelling already blooming beneath her trouser leg. Might be more than a bruise, could be a fracture. "I can walk," she insisted, pushing herself upright. She nearly proved herself wrong with the first step, wobbling until his hands were there, firm but gentle, steadying. Heat rushed to her face, not from embarrassment alone, but from a feeling she hadn't let herself feel in months: relief. "Sit," he said softly. "For once, just sit." She did. He cut away the fabric where it pinched, revealed a mottled bruise spreading across her shin. He touched nothing until she nodded, and even then his fingers were careful. "You should rest it for a few days," he said. "Keep it wrapped, elevate when you can." And the cabin, the question slipped out raw. He looked toward the half-built walls at the hamster wheel of determination behind her eyes. "The cabin will wait. The land doesn't go anywhere." She shook her head. Waiting was what had cost her before. Waiting on people, waiting on permission, waiting on promises that never bridged the gap. "I can't." He reclined back on his heels, considering. "Then, all right, then I'll help you." It isn't charity," he said, cutting gently across her protest. "It's neighborly, and it's selfish a little. I like having something to do that matters to someone besides cattle. Let me help." Her mouth pressed into a line. She weighed the old vow, "Rust no one," against the practical reality of the throbbing pain and the tower of logs yet untouched. She exhaled slowly. "For a few days," she said. "We'll see after that." He smiled, small and satisfied. "We'll see." Those few days unfolded into a rhythm. Illy arrived each morning with supplies: rope, nails, fresh biscuits wrapped in cloth. He asked before touching anything, listened when she explained how she'd planned the angle of the roof to shed snow, nodded in approval like an equal. He worked with easy competence, lifting what she couldn't, teaching without condescension when she asked questions. Claire found herself watching the way his shoulders moved beneath his shirt, the deliberate patience in his actions. Work done well, she realized, was its own kind of tenderness. In the quiet stretches between tasks, they talked. Haltingly at first. She learned he'd once dreamed of a house full of laughter, that he carved small wooden animals on winter nights and left them on fence posts for passing children to find. He learned she loved the hush just before dawn, that she'd read every book she could find on homesteading, that she hummed when concentrating and didn't realize it. They skirted around the deeper things, not out of secrecy, but out of respect. Some truths needed time to be invited. The bruise faded slowly. The walls rose more quickly. By the end of the second week, the cabin recognized its future in the air. Door framed, windows marked, roof beams ready. Claire felt something unfamiliar settle into her bones, pride that wasn't laced with bitterness, gratitude that wasn't burdened with fear. One evening, after they'd set the final ridge beam, they stood side by side, looking at what they'd done. The sky was awash of gold and violet. A hawk traced circles overhead. "You built this," Illy said. "I just carried a few heavy things." She laughed softly. "You carried more than that." He turned, studying her, the gentleness in his gaze almost unbearable. "You don't have to do everything alone, Claire." The words brushed a fault line in her, and for a moment she felt the old defenses rattling. "I know," she said, surprising them both. "I'm learning." He took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair, and looked away toward the horizon. "Sometimes I think we're all just building something one piece at a time, hoping it'll hold when the storms come." "And does it?" she asked. "Sometimes." His voice thinned. "Sometimes not." She understood that too well. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. He gave a small nod, accepting the sympathy without wallowing in it. They let the silence be companionable. The storm came in late autumn, earlier than either expected. Dark clouds stacked like bruises across the sky, and a wind with teeth tore across the prairie. Illy had just finished tightening his barn doors when he glanced toward the ridge and felt a knot of dread tighten in his gut. Claire's roof still needed shingles nailed on one side. A storm like this could peel unfinished boards clean off, or worse, bring the whole structure down. Without thinking, he saddled the chestnut and rode hard through the rising howl. He reached her clearing as the first fat drops slammed into the ground. Claire was on the roof, hair whipping, hammering as if she could outpace the sky. "Claire," he shouted. She turned, eyes fierce. "Almost finished. Get down," he called back. "It's not worth the risk." "This cabin is everything I have," she said, voice raw. "I won't watch it wash away." He guided the horse under the eaves, dismounted, and climbed the ladder. The shingles rattled beneath their boots. He crawled toward her, rain lashing their faces. Thunder rolled, deep and close. "We'll lose more if you fall," he said, gripping her wrist. "Let me help. Together we can nail it down fast." Her gaze locked on his, some stubborn part of her measuring the storm edge against the stubbornness of another person's promise. Then she nodded. They worked in frantic tandem, passing nails, slamming them home, bodies braced against the wind. Each clap of thunder felt like a giant's hand on the roof. Water soaked them through, but the shingles held. When the final row was fastened, they crawled to the ladder and climbed down, collapsing under the overhang, breathless and laughing at the wildness of it. The storm raged another hour, pounding the cabin, rattling the windows, and the walls, the logs, the roof they'd placed together held. Later, inside, huddled by a small fire, Claire wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Illy handed her a tin cup of coffee, his hands shaking a little from the adrenaline. "You were right," she said, staring at the flames, "about not having to do everything alone." He watched the firelight dance across her face, softening the lines of fatigue and fear. "You did the brave part," he said. "You built something worth saving." She turned toward him, the moment stretched, delicate as silk. "So did you," she said. "Out there, after everything, you kept living." He swallowed. "Some days that was the only work I could manage." The admission hung between them, honest as rain. "I'm glad you did," she said. He reached for her hand, slow enough that she could pull away if she wanted. She didn't. Their fingers laced together, awkward at first, then right. The wind eased, the fire popped. Outside, the land breathed again. Winter taught them the language of survival as a pair. They shared chores and stories, laughter and arguments, small comforts like the first biscuits baked in her new oven. Illy went home at night for a while. Then the snow deepened and the roads turned treacherous, and he stayed more often, mending tack by the fire while she mended clothes. The cabin, once a fortress built to keep the world out, learned to hold warmth without fear. One evening in late February, after a day spent feeding livestock and cutting wood, Illy stood by the door, hat twisting in his hands. "I keep wanting to ask something," he said. She lifted her eyes, calm, then asked. He took a breath. "I don't want to take your independence from you. I don't want to own a single piece of your sky. But he struggled, then finished simply, "I'd like to share it, if you'll have me." Her heart beat once, hard. The old warnings rose like ghosts, then, strangely, bowed their heads, because this didn't feel like possession. It felt like partnership, like two sets of hands on the same stubborn log. "I built this place to make sure I'd never be trapped again," she said. "I know, and I don't plan on stopping building. There will always be something next." He smiled. "Good, I like projects." She stepped closer. "Then stay, not because I need saving, because I want choosing." He let out a breath that was half laugh, half prayer. "Then I choose too." They stood there, hand in hand, the future unfolding not as a sudden miracle, but as a continuation. A beam set in place, another log lifted, a roof shingle nailed tight against weather. The work of love, like the work of homesteading, was not a grand gesture. It was daily, it was imperfect, it was miraculous by inches. In the spring, wildflowers spilled across the ridge. Calves were born, bright and wobbly. The cabin's walls aged into a deeper honey color, warm with memory. Sometimes Claire would pause at the doorway, listening to the sounds inside, a kettle whistling, Illy humming off, key, the crackle of the hearth, and she would smile, amazed that the shape of her solitude had changed. She was still building, always building, fences, gardens, new habits of trust, and Illy, in his quiet way, was building too, ending parts of himself that had gone unused, opening rooms in his heart he thought locked forever. On a late summer evening, when the light was the color of ripe peaches and the air full of crickets, they sat on the porch steps, shoulders touching. The world stretched wide and generous around them. She rested her head against his shoulder. He rested his cheek atop her hair. It took a lot of logs to make this, she said. He squeezed her hand, worth every single one. And in the gentle hush that followed, they both understood. The cabin had been the beginning, not the end. The real home they were building was made of shared mornings, repaired fences, forgiveness, and the steady, unremarkable courage of staying.